April 13th, 1942, Port Moresby, New Guinea. Captain Boyd Wagner of the 8th Fighter Group watched another P-39 Airacobra spin into the jungle, its pilot unable to recover from a maneuver that should have been routine. The 5th such loss that week. Around him, pilots who had survived encounters with Japanese Zero fighters spoke in hushed tones about the aircraft they had been given to defend the Southwest Pacific. "It climbs like a homesick brick," one lieutenant muttered. "Get above 10,000 feet and the engine chokes like it's drowning." The Zeros danced circles around us at altitude. What these American pilots did not know was that 6,000 miles away in the Soviet Union, their counterparts were achieving remarkable success with the exact same aircraft. Soviet pilots would eventually score more kills in the P-39 than any other American fighter type flown by any air force in any conflict. The aircraft deemed nearly worthless in the Pacific would become the mount of choice for Soviet aces, including Alexander Pokryshkin, who achieved 59 confirmed victories flying Airacobras. The puzzle of how one aircraft could be simultaneously considered the worst American fighter and a devastating weapon of war reveals a story more complex than simple judgments of good or bad. Context, as military historians would later recognize, mattered far more than the aircraft itself. The Bell P-39 Airacobra represented genuinely revolutionary thinking when it first flew in April 1939 at Wright Field, Ohio. Chief designer Robert Woods and project engineer Harlan Poyer created an aircraft unlike anything previously attempted. The Allison V-1710 engine sat not in the nose but behind the pilot, connected to the propeller through a 10-foot drive shaft running between the pilot's legs. This unconventional arrangement allowed designers to mount a 37mm M4 cannon firing through the propeller hub, providing firepower unprecedented in American fighters. The tricycle landing gear, another innovation, eliminated the taildragger configuration that caused countless ground accidents and improved pilot visibility during takeoff and landing. The prototype XP-39 achieved speeds of 390 miles per hour at 20,000 feet during initial testing, equipped with a General Electric turbo supercharger that maintained engine power at high altitude. Army Air Corps officers watched the sleek fighter with satisfaction, believing they had found their next-generation interceptor. The specifications promised a service ceiling above 32,000 feet with a turbo supercharger delivering manifold pressure that kept the Allison engine producing full power, well above altitudes where most fighters struggled. Combat radius exceeded 450 miles. Armament included not only the massive cannon but also two .50 caliber machine guns in the nose and four .30 caliber guns in the wings. Then came the decision that would define the P-39's reputation. In August 1939, at a pivotal meeting between Bell Aircraft, the Army Air Corps, and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, Company President Larry Bell proposed removing the turbo supercharger from production aircraft. The reasons offered included concerns about aerodynamic drag from the supercharger installation and supposed weight savings. Historians have debated Bell's true motivation. Some suggest the company desperately needed cash flow and feared delays from supercharger production problems. Others point to wind tunnel data that supposedly showed excessive drag. Whatever the reason, the Army accepted the proposal. The production P-39 retained only a single-stage, single-speed supercharger with a critical altitude around 12,000 feet. Above that height, performance degraded rapidly as the engine lost power in thinner air. The aircraft that had promised high-altitude supremacy became a low-altitude fighter by default, incapable of matching enemy fighters operating above 15,000 feet. When American pilots received P-39s in 1941 and 1942, they inherited an aircraft fundamentally mismatched to its intended role. By December 7, 1941, nearly 600 Airacobras had been built. When Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, the P-39 stood as one of America's frontline fighters, despite its altitude limitations having become apparent during testing. The British Royal Air Force, which had ordered Airacobras under the export designation P-400, conducted trials and rejected the aircraft. Performance tests at Boscombe Down revealed the Airacobra reached 355 miles per hour at 13,000 feet, but suffered dramatically at higher altitudes. RAF evaluators noted the aircraft was inferior to their existing Hurricanes and Spitfires for air superiority missions over Europe, where combat regularly occurred above 20,000 feet. The British declared the Airacobra unsuitable and returned most of their order. The United States requisitioned 200 of those British aircraft. When America entered the war, these P-400s were rushed to the Pacific along with standard P-39 models. This deployment would cement the Airacobra's reputation as inadequate, but the blame lay not with the aircraft's inherent design, but with the operational environment it faced. The Southwest Pacific Theater in 1942 presented the worst possible conditions for the P-39. Japanese Zero fighters, flown by veteran pilots with years of combat experience over China, dominated the skies. The Zero excelled at high altitude with exceptional climb rate and maneuverability. Combat regularly occurred between 15,000 and 25,000 feet. American early warning systems were primitive or non-existent. Coast watchers and crude radar provided minimal notice of incoming raids. P-39 pilots often scrambled with Japanese formations already overhead at altitude. Climbing to meet the enemy meant struggling through the Airacobra's weakest performance envelope. At 15,000 feet, the P-39's Allison engine produced perhaps 70% of its rated power. At 20,000 feet, barely 50%. Zero pilots quickly learned they could simply climb away from pursuing Airacobras, then dive back down with speed and altitude advantage. The 8th Fighter Group deployed to Australia in February 1942, equipped with P-39s. From April through August, they fought a desperate campaign over New Guinea against numerically superior Japanese forces. Combat reports reveal the frustration. Encounters with Zeros typically began with American pilots at disadvantage, struggling for altitude while enemy fighters positioned overhead. The P-39's roll rate was excellent and diving speed respectable, but these advantages meant little when enemy fighters controlled the vertical dimension. From May to August 1942, 5th Air Force P-39 units claimed approximately 80 Japanese aircraft but lost similar numbers of Airacobras. The exchange ratio roughly 1-to-1 against an enemy that should have been defeated by American industrial and technical superiority. Individual pilots achieved success through tactics that maximized the P-39's strengths. The aircraft was ruggedly built with pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks that became standard after early production. The 37mm cannon, when it functioned reliably, could destroy enemy aircraft with a single hit. Close to sea level, where engine power remained adequate, the P-39 could maneuver effectively. But these advantages required specific circumstances rare in Pacific combat. Most encounters began at altitude where the Airacobra was fundamentally outclassed. The Guadalcanal campaign from August 1942 onward saw P-39s operating as part of the Cactus Air Force, the desperate collection of Marine, Navy and Army aircraft defending Henderson Field. Here the Airacobra found a role better suited to its capabilities: ground attack. The heavily armed and armoured fighter proved devastating against Japanese troops attempting to retake the airfield. The nose-mounted cannon destroyed bunkers and vehicles with precision. Low-level strafing runs utilised the P-39's stability and firepower. Guns salvaged from damaged Airacobras were mounted on PT boats, testimony to the weapon's effectiveness when properly employed. But ground attack was not the mission for which the aircraft had been designed, and pilots knew they were using a thoroughbred racehorse to pull a plough. Pacific Theater P-39 pilots consistently requested replacement with any other fighter type. The P-38 Lightning, P-47 Thunderbolt, and especially the P-51 Mustang, all offered superior high-altitude performance. By late 1943, American factories were producing these aircraft in sufficient numbers that P-39s were withdrawn from frontline Pacific service. The Airacobra's Pacific reputation was sealed, an inadequate fighter forced upon pilots who deserved better. This narrative became the dominant historical memory. Found in pilot memoirs and popular histories, the P-39 was America's worst fighter, a desperate measure during desperate times. Yet simultaneous to this Pacific failure, an entirely different story unfolded in the Soviet Union. Beginning in 1942, the USSR received P-39s through Lend-Lease, eventually obtaining approximately 4,700 of the nearly 9,600 Airacobras produced. Soviet pilots not only accepted the aircraft but embraced it, achieving kill ratios that suggested they were flying an entirely different machine. The highest scoring Allied ace who flew any American fighter type was Soviet pilot Alexander Pokrishkin, with 59 confirmed victories, all in P-39s. Grigory Rechkalov scored 56 victories flying Airacobras. Nikolai Gulayev achieved 57 kills. Overall, Soviet P-39 pilots claimed thousands of German aircraft destroyed. How could the same aircraft be worthless in the Pacific and phenomenally successful in the Soviet Union? The answer lies in understanding operational context. The Eastern Front Air War occurred primarily between sea level and 12,000 feet, precisely the altitude band where the P-39 performed best. German and Soviet forces fought massive ground battles, where air support focused on low and medium altitude operations. Tactical bombing, ground attack, and fighter sweeps rarely exceeded 15,000 feet. In this environment, the Airacobra's altitude limitations became irrelevant while its strengths were fully exploited. Soviet pilots also made systematic modifications that improved performance. They removed the wing-mounted 30 caliber machine guns, saving weight and reducing drag. Some units removed radio equipment deemed unreliable, further lightening the aircraft. Armor behind the pilot's seat, already substantial, was sometimes augmented. Soviet mechanics became expert at maintaining the Allison engine under harsh field conditions. These modifications optimized the aircraft for the specific combat environment rather than accepting the standard American configuration. Training doctrine differed fundamentally between American and Soviet pilots. American fighter doctrine in 1942 emphasized individual initiative and flexible tactics, but assumed technological superiority. When that assumption proved false in the Pacific, pilots struggled to adapt. Soviet doctrine emphasized tight formation, flying with wingmen providing mutual support. Veteran pilots mentored novices in systematic tactics developed through years of brutal combat. Soviet Airacobra pilots learned to use the aircraft's excellent visibility from the bubble canopy, its powerful armament and its rugged construction. They fought at altitudes where the aircraft was competitive and avoided circumstances where it was outmatched. The comparison with the P-40 Warhawk illuminates the contextual nature of aircraft evaluation. The P-40 suffered similar altitude limitations with its Allison engine, yet earned a respectable reputation in China, North Africa, and the Southwest Pacific. The difference was expectation and deployment. Nobody expected the P-40 to fight at high altitude. It was understood as an interim fighter suitable for ground attack and low-altitude combat. Tactics were developed around its capabilities. The P-39, conversely, was deployed as a frontline interceptor in the Pacific despite its known altitude problems, creating inevitable disappointment. Technical specifications reveal the P-39 was not an inherently bad aircraft. Maximum speed of 376 miles per hour at critical altitude compared favorably to contemporaries. The Zero's top speed was 331 miles per hour. The P-40 reached 360 miles per hour. In level flight below 12,000 feet, the Airacobra was competitive. Its roll rate of 90 degrees per second exceeded most opponents. Dive speed reached 525 miles per hour before pilots risked control problems. Armament was devastating when it functioned. The 37mm cannon fired high explosive shells that could destroy a fighter with one hit or cripple a bomber. The problems were specific rather than general. Climb rate was mediocre, requiring nearly 6 minutes to reach 15,000 feet, when an enemy fighter might accomplish the same climb in 4 minutes. That 2-minute difference meant American pilots consistently found themselves below enemy formations. Service ceiling of 35,000 feet was theoretical. Above 20,000 feet, performance degraded so severely that combat became impossible. Range of 650 miles limited operational radius. In the vast Pacific, this restricted defensive coverage around bases. The 37mm cannon, while powerful, suffered reliability problems. Feed mechanisms jammed. The limited ammunition supply of 30 rounds was exhausted quickly in combat. These specific deficiencies might have been addressed through tactical adaptation, as Soviet forces demonstrated. But Pacific theater conditions prevented such adaptation. The strategic situation was desperate throughout 1942. American forces were outnumbered, outpositioned, and frequently outfought. Airfields were under constant attack. Supply lines stretched thousands of miles. Replacement aircraft and pilots arrived slowly. In this environment, tactical innovation was difficult. Pilots flew the aircraft they were given under circumstances not of their choosing. When those circumstances consistently placed them at disadvantage, The aircraft was blamed. The Soviet experience suggests that with proper employment, the P-39 was a capable fighter. Soviet aces used the aircraft's strength systematically. The powerful armament compensated for fewer firing opportunities. A single good shot could end an engagement. The heavy nose armament was harmonized precisely on the center line, unlike wing-mounted guns that required convergence calculations. Where the bullet stream went, destruction followed. The rugged construction allowed aggressive tactics. Soviet pilots were less concerned about battle damage because the Airacobra could absorb punishment. The tricycle landing gear proved invaluable on primitive Soviet airfields where conventional taildraggers ground-looped regularly. Visibility from the bubble canopy gave Soviet pilots situational awareness that compensated for inferior radios. German Luftwaffe pilots on the Eastern Front respected the P-39. Intelligence reports noted its heavy armament and robust construction. Unlike Japanese Zero pilots who could exploit altitude advantages, German fighters on the Eastern Front often fought in the same altitude band where the Airacobra was effective. Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 pilots could not simply climb away from combat. Ground-level engagements where the Airacobra performed adequately were common. The result was that German pilots faced a dangerous opponent rather than easy prey. The question of whether the P-39 deserves its reputation as America's worst fighter requires understanding what that judgment means. If worst signifies inherently flawed design, the designation is unfair. The aircraft's unconventional engineering was sound. The mid-engine layout worked. The tricycle gear was actually superior to conventional configurations. The heavy cannon armament was conceptually excellent. If worst means unsuited to the missions it was assigned in American service, the judgment has merit. The Pacific Theater in 1942 demanded high-altitude performance the P-39 could not provide. American pilots deserved better equipment for the circumstances they faced. But the broader lesson concerns the danger of absolute judgments about military equipment. Weapon systems do not exist in isolation. Their effectiveness depends on tactical employment, operational environment, training doctrine, maintenance capabilities, and strategic context. The same rifle can be excellent for one type of warfare and inadequate for another. The same tank can dominate in certain terrain and fail in different conditions. The P-39's contradictory reputation demonstrates this principle. In the hands of Soviet pilots fighting at low altitude over the Eastern Front, it was formidable. In the hands of American pilots facing high-altitude intercept missions in the Pacific without adequate early warning, it was inadequate. Modern air forces understand this contextual nature of effectiveness. Fighter procurement considers the specific missions aircraft will perform and the environments where they will operate. The F-35 Lightning II has variants for Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps, because each service faces different operational requirements. The lesson the P-39 teaches is that there are no universally good or bad weapons, only appropriate or inappropriate employment. American planners in 1942 deployed the Airacobra inappropriately. They assigned an aircraft with known altitude limitations to a theater where altitude performance was critical. They provided inadequate early warning systems that forced interceptors to scramble from disadvantaged positions. They failed to develop tactics that might have mitigated the aircraft's weaknesses. The pilots paid the price for these planning failures. The human cost of inappropriate deployment deserves recognition. Every pilot who died in an unequal fight against Zeros deserved equipment suited to their mission. Every squadron that suffered disproportionate losses because their aircraft could not climb to combat altitude represented a failure of planning and procurement. The bravery of men who flew P-39s in the Pacific is unquestionable. Their willingness to engage superior enemies in inferior circumstances demonstrates courage that transcended their equipment. But courage should not be necessary to compensate for inadequate tools. The proper lesson from the Pacific P-39 experience is that military forces owe their personnel appropriate equipment for assigned missions. When that principle is violated, lives are wasted. Conversely, the Soviet success with the Airacobra demonstrates that skilled, adaptive forces can maximize the potential of available equipment. Soviet pilots did not receive perfect aircraft. They received what Lend-Lease provided and made it work through tactical innovation, systematic training, and ruthless focus on effectiveness. They removed unnecessary equipment, modified what could be improved, and developed doctrine around the aircraft's actual capabilities rather than its theoretical specifications. This adaptive approach turned an aircraft judged inadequate by the RAF and problematic in the Pacific into a war-winning weapon on the Eastern Front. For historians and aviation enthusiasts, the P-39 offers a case study in the complexity of evaluating historical aircraft. Simple rankings of best and worst ignore the contextual factors that determined actual combat effectiveness. The Airacobra was neither the best American fighter nor the worst. It was an aircraft with specific capabilities that proved highly effective in appropriate circumstances and deeply flawed in inappropriate deployment. Understanding why requires examining not just technical specifications, but operational context, tactical employment, training systems, maintenance capabilities, and strategic circumstances. This holistic evaluation reveals truths that simple judgments obscure. The nearly 9,600 Airacobras produced during the war served in multiple theatres with varied success. Free French forces flew P-39s in North Africa and Italy. The Italian co-belligerent Air Force used them after Italy's surrender. Commonwealth forces deployed them in secondary roles. Total production included multiple variants with improved engines, armament configurations, and equipment fits. The P-39Q model, the most numerous variant, incorporated lessons from combat experience with refined systems and increased reliability. By the time production ended in August 1944, Bell Aircraft had created a mature design that addressed many early problems. But by then, newer fighters had superseded the Airacobra in most roles. The legacy of the P-39 extends beyond its combat record. The innovative engineering influenced post-war aircraft design. The mid-engine configuration, while not widely adopted for fighters, proved valuable for other applications. The tricycle landing gear became universal for jet aircraft, where high landing speeds made tail draggers impractical. The concept of a heavy cannon as primary armament influenced designs worldwide. Soviet fighters of the Cold War period emphasized nose-mounted cannons, reflecting lessons learned with the P-39. American close-air support aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II mounted massive cannon as their primary weapons, echoing the Airacobra's philosophy that firepower compensated for other limitations. For veterans, the P-39 evoked mixed emotions. Pacific veterans generally remembered it negatively as equipment that failed them when they needed it most. Soviet veterans remembered it positively as a reliable weapon that served them well. Both perspectives are valid because both reflect genuine experiences in vastly different circumstances. The aircraft that could not protect Port Moresby at altitude could destroy German formations at low level over the Kuban. Same aircraft, different wars. In defending the P-39 against its reputation as America's worst fighter, the goal is not to claim it was secretly excellent. The goal is accurate historical understanding. The Airacobra had real limitations that rendered it unsuitable for high-altitude interception missions. It also had genuine strengths that made it effective in low-altitude combat when properly employed. American deployment in the Pacific emphasized the limitations, while Soviet employment on the Eastern Front emphasized the strengths. The aircraft itself remained constant. The context changed everything. The story of the P-39 Airacobra teaches that military effectiveness is never solely about hardware. Training, tactics, maintenance, deployment decisions, strategic context, and operational environment matter as much as specifications. An inferior weapon in skilled hands with appropriate doctrine can defeat a superior weapon poorly employed. A marginally adequate aircraft in the right circumstances outperforms a theoretically superior aircraft in wrong circumstances. These lessons remain relevant for modern military forces making procurement and deployment decisions. For the pilots who flew the Airacobra in all theatres, their experiences shaped the aircraft's reputation more than any technical manual ever could. Their testimonies, both positive and negative, reflect the reality that equipment alone never determines outcomes. Human factors transform machines into weapons systems. The P-39 in American Pacific service was a fighter. Its pilots neither trusted nor respected, handicapped by altitude limitations in an environment demanding high-altitude performance. The P-39 in Soviet service was a fighter its pilots learned to master, employed in circumstances where its strengths outweighed its weaknesses. Both narratives are true. Neither is complete without the other. The final assessment must acknowledge complexity. Was the P-39 America's worst fighter? In the specific context of Pacific high-altitude interception missions in 1942, it was arguably inadequate, though whether that made it worse depends on comparing it to other inadequate aircraft of the period. In the context of Eastern Front low-altitude combat from 1942 to 1945, it was demonstrably effective, proven by the scores of Soviet aces who achieved remarkable success flying it. The contradiction resolves only when we abandon simplistic judgments and embrace the contextual nature of military effectiveness. The P-39 Airacobra was an aircraft that taught the lesson that there are no universally good or bad weapons, only appropriate or inappropriate uses. That lesson, learned at terrible cost in the Pacific and validated through success in the Soviet Union, remains among the most important insights military historians can offer.